In this episode of Commentaries on Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, we are going to jump into Chapter 6 on the subject of man and start with the first section, Living Organisms as Goal-Directed and Conditional. Stay tuned. All right, so let's dive right into Chapter 6. And the question we're going to explore in the introductory material, no surprise here, is what is man? And what we get to start from Leonard is a whole range of examples, the different views of man by different philosophers, everybody from Plato to Dewey to Ayn Rand. And what Leonard stresses is that the philosophic question really amounts to what is the essence of man? And this is a crucial question because it's really at the center of philosophy. If you think we've had now metaphysics and epistemology, the two basic branches, and then we're going to get to the evaluative branches, the branches based on value judgments, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. And at the center is going to be a view of what is man? What is the essence of man? But and this is what Leonard stresses, even though it's true that a view of man is going to emerge out or depends on a metaphysics and epistemology, from objectivism's perspective anyway, you can't just kind of read it off or deduce it from those earlier branches. We have to bring in fresh observations, and so that's why we're going to start, or objectivism starts, by situating man in the context of he is a living organism. So we'll get to that in a minute, but let's make a few observations about this introductory material. So I think it's very interesting that people disagree on what is man, or at least if you asked people on the street, you're like, do we have different views of what man is? I think they would say not really, or at least you'd have to do some explaining to get them to see it. And in part, it's kind of a parochialness, because if you really paid attention to different cultures and certainly different periods of history, we see diametrically different views of man. And if you really think about that different views of man depend heavily on metaphysics and epistemology, then that shouldn't be a surprise, right? Because, I mean, just contrast the objectivist view of those subjects with, say, the religious view, that there's two worlds, a higher spiritual world, and then this kind of like semi-real, not so important world that's a realm of miracles and ghosts and demons and whatever else that you have in a particular religious view. And that human beings are incompetent and incapable of knowing at least the most important truths about the world, or to the extent we can know them, we can't know them through our mind. We can only know them through some form of, whether it's mystic revelation or blind faith in an authority. And it should be no surprise that you're not going to come up with John Galt on those kinds of premises, that you're going to come up with the kind of medieval view of man that we see in the kind of art and statues of the era. Because, I mean, man in a world that he cannot understand, and man in a world that is kind of low and sinful, you're not going to get kind of a superlative proud hero. You're going to get these kind of withered, crippled, fearful figures, right? So that's one way to look at it, but I think there's another perspective on this issue that I want to indicate, but I do so with a little trepidation, because I'm going to invoke something that Ayn Rand wrote that I regard as some of her most difficult material, and I don't fully understand it. So consider this not Don Watkins giving the definitive analysis of how Ayn Rand thinks about this issue, but a kind of teaser and encouragement to study some of her less studied writings. And so here's what I'm talking about. We've said in past videos that from objectivism's perspective, we form an implicit philosophy as we're growing up, what Ayn Rand called a mongrel philosophy. And we've talked about the way in which Onkar Ghate has pointed out that shows up in things like our sense of life, which is a implicit, basically equivalent to a metaphysics. And then there's your psychoepistemology, your mind's automatic way of functioning. And then there's your self-esteem, which is your kind of automatic emotional judgment of yourself as able to live and worthy of living or not. And we've also said that the whole task of philosophy is really to bring to the surface your mongrel philosophy and check it self-critically and think, does this really conform to the facts? What are my reasons for thinking this is true? And correcting your mongrel philosophy to the extent that it's wrong. But it's taking an implicit philosophy and now bringing it under the control of your conscious mind and making sure, yeah, this is really my framework for thinking about things that I have good reasons and good arguments to think is true. We've also talked about Ayn Rand's point that evil philosophies are systems of rationalization. And so one way you can think about what's going on is with an evil philosophy is that a person has a mongrel philosophy, and instead of bringing it to the surface so that they can self-critically examine it, what they're doing is they're trying to justify, articulate, and protect from attack their mongrel philosophy. Their kind of emotional way of looking at the world, they're trying to safeguard with arguments. And that's the rationalization. It's false reasons. It's dressing something up that wasn't arrived at by reason in the kind of cloak of reason. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. What we actually want to do is bring the light of reason onto our implicit philosophy. But so this kind of is the context in which we can think about a person's implicit view of man. And in her article, Art in a Sense of Life, which is in the Romantic Manifesto, Ayn Rand has a really fascinating account of how she thinks about the development of a person's view of man as such, and that it's rooted in a process that she calls emotional generalization, which is the grouping of things by the emotions that they evoke. And so you would take things that evoke, let's say, similar emotions. And I think a kind of list that she gives is something like the folks next door, routine, a picnic. And she says that depending on a person's view of themselves, those things will evoke a different kind of similar emotion. And that a view of man is really going to emerge out of this emotional generalization stew, if you will. But that it's going to be conditioned then by a person's view of themselves, and that it's one's view of oneself. And is the universe fit for me? Am I able to cope with it? And the kinds of questions like that, viewing the universe through the scope of its relationship to you, that will lead to a view of man as such. And again, I really encourage you to read the essay, but in particular, I mean, here's the quote of the section I'm thinking of. So she's, talking about this process of emotional generalization, and she says, even though such emotional abstractions grow into a metaphysical view of man, their origin lies in an individual's view of himself and of his own existence. And so the definitely explore that, but and the point here is not that our psychology determines our philosophy or anything like that. It's that we have the power to check these things, but that if you think about bad philosophies, it's their negative view of man really emerges from a negative view of themselves and their ability to cope with the world. And so just one kind of takeaway here is it's really useful to say, okay, we're studying Objectivism's view of man, but what was my view, or what was it as a teenager? And we often have a very strong sense of how we viewed ourselves, how we viewed our relationship to the world, to other people. And so it's really helpful to think about that and think, do I have remnants of that? As we're going through and thinking, all right, well, what's Ayn Rand's argument for her view of man, and do I agree with it? Now, an overview of Objectivism's answer, this is what we'll cover in the chapter, but essentially it boils down to three things. Man is a living being, man is a rational being, and man is an individualistic being, or that its reason functions in the context of it's an individual's reason that a person has to live by and function by. So we're going to go into all those issues. And in essence, you can think about this section. We've talked about the way in which all of Objectivism's normative guidance really amounts to a goal plus a metaphysically given fact. And these are going to be the three most key metaphysically given facts, and that we're going to cash in on in the next chapter, and also the chapter on politics. So just to give you a preview, that we're going to get in the next section, here we get that we're a living organism, and next we're going to get the standard of value as man's life. Then we're going to get the man as a reason as our basic means of survival, and we're going to get rationality as our basic virtue. And then here we get that reason is a function of the individual, and in the next chapter it's going to be that the individual should be the beneficiary of his moral action. And then in these, of course, are going to feed into a view of right. So you have the view of the right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and it follows those same things. It's life, reason, and the individual as the unit of success. So there's a lot packed into this chapter that might not be obvious. And so let's then say, I want to say one more thing then about Objectivism's view of man, and then we'll turn to the specific issue of man as a living being. So as we transition, or just before we transition to man as a living being, the major point that I wanted to make about this is this could definitely come across as, yeah, well, isn't this at least obvious? Like, I get there's disagreements about man, but I mean, at least every philosopher gets that he's a living organism. And there's a real sense in which they don't. So if you take, for instance, the religious view, we're really a spiritual being. And yeah, we're trapped in this body and everything, but their view of man is not seen in the context of him as a living organism. Or if you take the kind of materialist view, which equates man with a bunch of atoms, again, it's not taking seriously that human beings are living organisms. And so if you think about Objectivism's definition of man as the rational animal, we usually focus on the rational part, right? This is what's distinctive about man. He survives by reason. And yes, that is probably the most important point in Objectivism. I mean, in fact, I think it is really the most central idea in Objectivism. But the genus matters too. It's that he's the rational animal, and that we need to grasp the facts about us as a biological organism in order to understand what's so distinctive about reason. And so that's really what we're going to dive into now. All right, so now we're going to get into Leonard's analysis of life. And he starts out by pointing out that there's one big distinction more than any other that we observe in all of the entities we perceive, and that is between the animate and the inanimate. And if we're looking at the animate, there's kind of two facts about them that are central to what distinguish them from everything else, and certainly two facts that philosophy has to take a lot of cognizance of. And that is that the actions of living organisms are self-generated, and that they're self-sustaining. They're goal-directed towards self-sustenance. So the self-generated part is pretty simple. It's that, yes, we have to take in energy from our environment, but it's that we organize and store that energy as entities and then direct it towards our goals. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. But what kind of goals do we pursue? It's not scattered. It's not that living organisms just take kind of random actions, that there's an organizing principle that we can see at work, is that it's directed to self-maintenance, self-repair. It's directed to preserving the entity in existence, the organism in existence. And Leonard distinguishes that from purposive behavior, the kind of projecting a goal and consciously going after it. What he's really talking about is that the actions of living organisms are such that they result, all else being equal, in the organism's continued existence. And and so then Leonard goes on then to distinguish this view, or to address a kind of counter argument that says, no, there's not really a fundamental metaphysical divide between living and non-living organisms. There's no difference between saying they have to maintain themselves in existence and like a marble statue is, going to stay in existence or not. They both face the same alternative between existence or non-existence. And Leonard is going to say that no, that does not at all make sense, because there is a vast difference between, a human being and the bullet that goes through him. It's, one is inanimate and the other went from animate to inanimate, and that you can't blur or equate those two things. And that more generally, the fact that we might be able to explain life one day in terms of more basic physical laws, so that you can understand that, the lower living organisms are, let's say, operating by the same physics as everything else in existence, doesn't, by explaining that, you don't erase the fact. You don't erase that there is a clear difference in a living organism and non-living organisms. And again, we'll have more to say about that as well. All right, so I find it helpful to really see this section as covering three key ideas. So one is that living action is self-generated. And the basic idea here is, yes, we take in energy from our surroundings, but then we direct it. That we are using our own store of energy in order to govern our actions. And so if you think about the difference between, like, there's a book on a couch and you push it off and it falls, that like the book was not generating its own energy. It was just being acted on by outside forces. And if you contrast that with something like there's a cat and you touch it, and it can do any number of things. It uses its own energy to direct its actions, whether it's, biting or clawing you, jumping off in fear and running away, or kind of pushing its head into your hand and trying to get some good pets. It's using its own energy in order to govern its action, rather than just responding to a bunch of external forces. Then it's living organisms act in ways that achieve values. So, we talked about this distinction between kind of purposeful behavior, and this is where we get the kind of initial idea of goal-directed. It's that I want some food, so I'm going to go grab some food. But if you're talking about living organisms, they engage in patterns of action much more widely than just this kind of conscious, purposeful sorts of actions. And you get, for example, Leonard's very eloquent sort of example of the healing process and the way that your body's marshaling resources to respond to this cut and direct it in a way that is valuable. Or the way you can think about it is that meets certain needs. That I've tried to stress that living action is not scattered or disintegrated. It's integrated towards fulfilling needs that keep us, the fulfillment of which keep us in existence, keep the organism alive. And so you can think about standard kind of vegetative examples of this, the plant turning its leaves towards the sun. But I really like even more, what you have to see is that this is occurring at every level. It's not like a single action out of context. It's I'll give a quote from Ayn Rand in a second, but it's, from the cellular level on, everything is marshaled in this direction. And I think, one way to think about it is, you take a critter and you put an obstacle in its way, right? So it's sitting there resting. Maybe it's even just a slug, and you shine a heat lamp on it. And then it's going to move in whatever direction gets it to the kind of temperature best suited for its life. Or if you think about there's a cat chasing after food and you put a kind of barrier in its way. It doesn't just sit there. It doesn't go off in some random direction. It finds a way around the barrier to the food, to the thing that's going to serve its life. And so what we see is that the actions of living organisms are directed towards things that result in life. So, that's radically different from like a ping pong ball, right? It's going to go whichever way the paddle goes. And if it hits a block, it's going to, bounce backward. It's not going to be directed towards something that is kind of a unified end of some sort. And so here's how Ayn Rand puts this overall point. I think it's really important to get this. She says, on the physical level, the functions of all living organisms, from the simplest to the most complex, from the nutritive function in the single cell of an amoeba to the blood circulation in the body of a man, are actions generated by the organism itself and directed to a single goal, the maintenance of the organism's life. And then she has a footnote. When applied to physical phenomenon, such as the automatic functions of an organism, the term goal-directed is not to be taken to mean purposive, a concept applicable only to the actions of a consciousness, and is not to imply the existence of any teleological principle operating in sentient nature. I use the term goal-directed in this context to designate the fact that the automatic functions of living organisms are actions whose nature is such that they result in the preservation of an organism's life. So I said there were 3 points, and now this is one that Leonard doesn't make and Ayn Rand doesn't make, but that Harry Binswanger does make, and that is that living organisms act in order to achieve values. And so this is, it comes out of Harry's work. His book is The Biological Basis of Teleological Concepts. If you're interested in any of the issues in this section, I definitely recommend that. I haven't even read the whole thing, but the stuff I have read is really brilliant. And I guess it's unfair for me to say, given that I haven't read the whole thing, but it's a really undervalued work in objectivism. But like I said, the things that are there, I think are deeply clarifying. But basically, if Ayn Rand's view is that you can make sense of organisms' actions only by seeing the way in which they're directed to maintaining that organism in existence, then what Harry is arguing is that no, the living organisms don't engage in purpose-driven actions, if you want to put it that way, at the vegetative level, but that those actions are goal-directed in the sense that it's not that the entity chooses to take the action in order to achieve a certain goal, but it's that natural selection has selected for actions on the basis of their survival value. So the basic idea is that, the first time an organism takes an action that is life promoting, you can't say, and I'm saying like through mutation or something, a kind of action that could be embodied in genes that get passed forward. You couldn't say that action or pattern of action was goal-directed. Yet in future generations, precisely because that action was selected for because of its survival value, we can say that those future actions are taken, those actions chosen for by, millions of years of evolution, are selected for because of their survival value. And so it's from an evolutionary perspective that we can say the plant turns its leaves to the sun because that allows the organism to survive. So again, this is not a point that the objectivist ethics is going to hinge on. We'll look at exactly what that argument is there. I'll have some things to say about it in this video. But I find that a deeply clarifying perspective, and it certainly reinforces the kind of argument that Ayn Rand is going to give. All right, so I want to end with this last topic, which is kind of a counter argument that comes up in this context. And that is, all right, you guys are talking about survival being the goal to which living organisms act, but isn't it actually reproduction? And so this is kind of a standard view. And the first thing I would say is that there's kind of a mistaken or potentially mistaken way of thinking about what Ayn Rand is arguing, which is essentially that, okay, living organisms pursue life as their goal, therefore we should too. And that's not the argument. We'll get more of the argument when we turn to chapter 6. But I want to say a few things about it now. So the first thing is, I don't think that there's a real justification for viewing things this way, or at least I think it's less obvious that that's the right way to view things. And what I mean is this. So if you take kind of the Harry Binswanger perspective we were just talking about, that it is natural selection, selecting for things that promote an organism's life. For lower organisms, what you get is not free will choices, but programming, selected for programming. And so, yes, if let's say a bird is reproducing, from one perspective, no, it's not doing that because its own act of reproduction is going to enhance its life. And indeed, as these people correctly point out, sometimes it can impair, it's really puts its life at more risk, requires a lot of energy and so on. And I mean, there's some animals who kind of like, in the very act of reproducing die. But from another perspective, why are they taking those actions? Well, they're taking those actions because their parents took those actions. And what happens if their parents hadn't taken those actions? Well, they wouldn't exist. So in other words, the fact that they are programmed to be reproducing creatures is what allowed them to exist in the first place. And so you can't say that, and so it's from that perspective that it's a life-promoting action. It's a life-promoting programming is the way that you can think about it. That programming has survival value for the creature because it's that programming which brought it to an existence in the first place. But now if you think Ayn Rand's analysis is much deeper than, hey, they pursue life, so we should too. Rather, what she points out, and we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, as I said, is that to grasp the concept value, to grasp any evaluative concepts, that's only possible, and those are only coherent in the context of an organism whose life or death is at stake. That you couldn't form it from the perspective of value. You couldn't get evaluative concepts on the basis of, will this thing successfully reproduce or not? Maybe the best way to put it is, imagine you had a bird who, through a genetic quirk, was born without the desire or ability to reproduce, and it just lived its bird life and then, died of old age. You couldn't say, well, that's bad for the bird. He didn't leave, or she didn't leave any babies around. Whereas if you had a thing that was kind of designed to reproduce, but it instantly, jumped off a cliff and died, then it wouldn't be, oh, it didn't leave babies. It would be, oh, no, like that's bad for the organism. It's dead now. It's out of existence. So it is, once you have a perspective of life and survival as the goal, uniting and integrating all of the different actions of an organism, then you can make sense of these kind of non-obvious or kind of unusual cases of action and think, well, how does that fit the pattern of life directing the actions of the organism? But if your starting point or your way of understanding things is reproduction, now maybe for a biologist that's really fruitful and helpful. I'm not disputing that. But from the perspective of philosophy and from the perspective of being able to evaluate things as good or bad, that is not at all a fruitful, helpful, or clarifying way to look at it. Now, here's how I actually think about it, because I think there's too much of a division being made of these two things. The way I see it is that what natural selection is actually selecting for is survival over the reproductive lifespan of the organism. It's survival over the reproductive lifespan of the organism. And with human beings, precisely because we're volitional, that we have to think about things not in terms of our reproductive lifespan, but our total full lifespan that's not capped by the need to reproduce. And yet even for us, I think a lot of what sort of like the biological buttons that we have to play with as we extend our lives longer and longer, a lot of that was shaped evolutionarily by
the kind of lifespan needed in order to, have and raise children. But so I don't think there's a deep division here. I think there's a real integration of that. It's not another, how would you put it? Ayn Rand's view is not that like the goal is lengthening life as much as possible. It's that you have a lifespan, and within, it's kind of a certain range of a normal lifespan, and you can try to extend it, and all else being equal, should try to extend it. But she's concerned with living a life within that lifespan, not concerned with just kind of the length on Earth. And the kind of connection that I'm drawing out is, well, what determines that lifespan at the kind of biological level? And that's the perspective from which you can bring in reproduction and say the kind of lifespans of organisms are probably very much tied to reproduction. That's sort of what everything is geared toward evolutionarily. But it's not that reproduction is the goal of actions. It's that survival over a reproductive lifespan is the goal of action. So I'm open to criticism in that. That's basically an idea I've come up with in the last 24 hours, but I find that clarifying, and maybe it's right and you will too, and maybe it's wrong and you can explain to me how it's wrong. So that's it for this video. Very excited next time when we're going to get to the most important idea in objectivism: reason is man's means of survival. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that bell so you don't miss a single episode. And if you want to stay in contact, the best way is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.